Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Basel Miami Beach. Welcome to Digital Dialogues. My name is Alan Brush. I'm the Global Head of Digital Platforms at Art Basel. And it's a huge honor to be here with you and kind of continue our transformative digital journey that we started earlier this year. We started off in Hong Kong with Jihan Zhu and collecting digitally forum at the Soho House, gathering a few people, and really kind of kicked off our new vision and mission to power the world of art and bring different communities together. We really believe that it's of utmost importance to bring both the digital traditional, contemporary art all together to create meaningful connections. I think we've got an amazing program ahead of 2 days with fantastic speakers, and I'm incredibly grateful for everyone coming. We heard that there is a bit of traffic between the Design District and South Beach. So yeah, incredibly grateful to be here with the team, with our co-hosts TAIEX, who have been part on our journey since Basel in Switzerland, and the feedback so far has been incredible. A huge shout out to Mara and the digital team who have been supporting and coordinating, securing this amazing location. And I'm handing over to Jenny to introduce you to the wider program. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Anna. Welcome also from my side, everyone. My name's Jenny Fulton. I'm Art Basel's head of editorial, and I had the honor of putting together this great program. So, yeah. And we're going to spend the next 2 days with different conversations spanning a wide range and wide-ranging questions. It's no secret that the last few years have seen an explosion in interest of art that incorporates or addresses new and not so new forms of technology, from blockchain-based practices to generative art and AI, and how these connect to photography, filmmaking, performance, and community-based practices, as well as forming a universe of their own. It feels like a timely moment to take stock and address it at this moment in time. And for this, we have assembled a stellar cast of panelists and thought leaders in the field, from artists such as Reas, Sarah Meyerhus, Sungwon Chung, Thank You X, and to thinkers and scholars and authors, including Christiane Paul, Amy Whitaker, and Tina Rivers-Ryan. We will be discussing a wide range of topics, including what digital art actually is, looking at the NFT market and how it's being impacted by the current boom in cryptocurrencies. And we will be looking at the connection between digital works and physical practices in a panel moderated by Stephanie von Regel entitled Going Phygital. And today, we will close with an interactive performance by Ana Maria Caballero, so do stay around for that. Tomorrow, we will have panels looking at the use of AI with Sungwon Chung and Kevin Abosch, looking at how we preserve digital art with Michael Connor of Rhizome and Regina Hasiani. And lastly, a discussion of the poetics of the digital with Operita and Ana Maria Caballero. I look forward to 2 days of exciting discussions. As a housekeeping note, please do keep your phones on silent. And unfortunately, due to the schedule, there will be no time for questions, but there will be time for mingling afterwards. With this, I would like to express my deep gratitude to our co-host TAIEX and hand over to the mic to the head of development, Stephanie von Regel. Thank you, Stephanie, and over to you.
Thank you, Jenny. Very honored to be part of this excellent event. TAIEX is a digital art platform. We're based in London, and we're very excited to be driving the digital conversation forward with such an amazing panel. So I'll give back the mic to you, Jenny, to announce the first panel. Thank you.
And thank you, Anna. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Stephanie in particular. I would like to welcome our first panel to join me on stage. I'm very honored to introduce the first panel. The topic is, what is digital art? And with me, I have Christiane Paul, the Curator of Digital Art at the Whitney Museum, Reas, artist and founder of File, and it will be moderated by Tina Rivers-Ryan, the Editor-in-Chief of Artforum. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you so much, Jenny, for inviting us to be here today. I know people always say it's a pleasure and an honor, but genuinely, seriously, Christiana and Casey have both been so influential in the field of digital art and a huge inspiration to me personally, and are really groundbreaking pioneers, and we overuse that language, but it's really true in the case of both of you. So for the next 45 minutes or so, we're gonna have a little bit of a conversation that's about what digital art actually is, which I'm not sure we're gonna completely answer that question, but the idea is maybe to put some more questions on the table and provide some frameworks for thinking through digital art and its history. And I hope that, I think for some of you in the audience, this material might be quite familiar. Maybe for others of you, it won't be. I think this will also be recorded and published online. So for those of you tuning in from the interwebs, this will hopefully be a kind of useful primer to some of the topics in this very complicated area of practice that is also part of contemporary art discourse, which is something that the three of us, I think, have all been advocating for throughout our careers and feel very strongly about. So thank you to Art Basel also for the invitation to be talking about digital art in the context of the mainstream contemporary art market. All right. The first thing we wanted to talk about was terminology. The title of this panel is What is Digital Art? And we just wanted to highlight that digital art has not always been digital art, and it is a field that goes by many different names, some of which are synonyms, some of which overlap in certain ways, but not in others. So we thought it might be helpful to articulate all of the various terms that have been used to describe artists who work with computers in some aspect of their field. So Christiane, I wondered if you wanted to narrate for us maybe a little bit your understanding of how we have evolved to a place where now we're using digital art as the kind of term, and then maybe Casey, you can also weigh in on whether or not you feel that's the right term that we should be using.
Thanks so much, Tina. Yeah, from the inception of the field, there have been so many different terms, and I think all of what you're seeing up on the slide intersects at some point or another, but does not necessarily mean the same thing. The early term was actually computer art, and that was what described the works by the early algorists who were creating work using code in the 60s, the groundbreaking shows in the mid-60s. So that was really named computer art. When I was hired at the Whitney in 2000, my title was actually different. I was the adjunct curator of new media arts. So digital became new media arts in the late 90s, early 2000s. Super confusing because the term was also used for video art at the time. So people kept sending me videotapes, and I constantly had to explain my title. Our argument at the time was that the new in new media really nicely covered a rapidly evolving field that was new all the time. And then, of course, other terms came along. Generative art has become a buzzword. Generative art is a subcategory of digital art. Or digital art is a subcategory of generative art, let's put it that way, because generative art per se can said to be thousands of years old in the sense of setting in motion a process that then in some automated fashion creates art. And then of course the whole crypto NFT world, also brought about new terminologies. I have also written about that at more length, the use of the term NFT art. While NFTs have nothing to do with art per se, they are an authentication mechanism and function in many cases as a certificate of authenticity. And it's a smaller subset of the work that really exists on-chain, uses the blockchain as a medium where you could say, okay, that's NFT art. Just outlining some of those terms. I don't know if you want me to go into more of a definition right now or wait until the next one.
I'm going to say, we're going to come back to the sort of blockchain and NFTs and how does that relate to this field of digital art. But Casey, maybe, I know I've talked to you about this before, but I'm always curious to hear your thoughts on, how you choose to identify as an artist. Like, would you call yourself a digital artist, and why or why not? And what does that term mean to you?
Yeah, my thinking on that changes from day to day. I like talking about art in general the most, but then sometimes I think it's interesting and right to talk about specific components. Like, let's talk about painting right now, or let's talk about digital art right now. I think there are things in their histories that sort of fold into what we call digital art right now. As Christiane said, generative art has been a term that's been used so frequently lately, and I think for me that's a term that makes more sense because it's thinking about artists making systems, and I think really for me the core of this is really about terms I don't like. Like, I like art that involves algorithms, I like art that involves computation, and I've disliked using those words in front of art or around art for such a long time, but it's been a struggle to come up with something that feels better. So I think digital art is a little wide for my specific interests, but I think it can be useful at times for sure.
Something that I realized dropped out from what you just said, though, was the notion of software and hardware, because neither computation nor algorithms necessarily require either of those. And so it's making me think about the fact that how we talk about what we're talking about is really shaped by the questions that we're asking, right? So if we're having a conversation about conservation, for example, then we probably are thinking about what we're working with as software art, or I don't know, thinking about it in a very particular way, right? Where we're thinking about it as like a data that's stored somewhere. Whereas if we're thinking about it from an art historical lens, we might be thinking about it more in terms of its use of algorithms or its conceptual frameworks, right? So I think maybe what I want to sort of leave us with as we go on to the next slide is this idea that like digital art itself, which is inherently mutable, and blockchain people can calm down for a second, but yes, digital art, right, inherently mutable, variable, iterative, performative, as Christiane has always emphasized, that our language itself, I think, needs to be a little fluid and flexible, right?
And in a way, it's that process that's most essential to it, and it doesn't matter if we're working with images or text or sound, it's sort of the computation and the permeability and the fluidness of it that really is what's most important.
Yeah, I mean, for myself, and I think this is also true for you too, from what I've heard you say, that's actually one of the things that's so exciting about working with this kind of material, right? As a curator, as an art historian, as a critic, because it is so unfixed and always changing, it just makes it kind of thrilling. Every day you come in and it's a different conversation. So, all right. So with that understanding, we also, do need to talk a little bit about definitions. So, okay, it's fluid, it's unfixed, but still in a very concrete sense, logistically, and especially from the perspective of institutional frameworks, it does help to sort of define terms. And so I've put on the screen a text that is too long for anyone to read unless you're watching this on the internet and you can freeze frame. But this is from a text that Christiane wrote in conjunction with a very important exhibition she organized called Programmed, which we'll see again in a couple minutes. And Christiane, I wondered if you just wanted to elaborate anything. I highlighted my favorite, most useful bits in yellow, just personally. But if you wanted to say more about what you've written up here.
Sure. So I always say that one of the most important distinctions one needs to make is between the use of digital technologies as a tool versus a medium. Almost any work today uses digital technologies as a tool. Photographs you see in galleries are actually digital prints, sculptures are done by rapid prototyping. But that doesn't make them digital art, and I don't mean that in any dismissive sense, but you just need another aesthetic vocabulary to talk about them. And digital art really uses the technologies as a medium in conceptual and practical ways, reflecting on it the qualities of the medium. There was an earlier definition, very narrow one, that said it's art created, stored, and distributed by means of digital technologies, but that would not cover the early algorithmic work done in the 60s, which ended up being plotter drawings, although it's deeply algorithmic, of course, nor does it cover the whole post-digital movement and moment, which was this material turn where younger artists really created work that in the end would take material form, but was impossible to create without network processes, without digital technologies. So I think those are some distinctions to make. At the core, I think digital art is digital born in some way.
But as you said at the very outset of your answer, not just digital born, but also conceptually engages with
Absolutely.
digital frameworks, digital ideas, right? All right.
I think for me, there's three paths into there. One was the tool. The other is the medium, and I think the other is culture too. And we see art everywhere is involved with digital culture, internet culture.
I think we have a slide for that, but I think that comes later. Sorry, we have a slide for that. I think that comes later. So can we hold that thought, Casey, for a second? Okay, and then let's go. Here we go. Did you want to speak to this?
I kind of snuck this slide in at the last minute. It's from Christiane's book, but I think it's good just to like cast this wide net of the topology and it's, so much energy the last couple of years have been focused on visual art that's been released as NFTs, but digital art decades long, so many different media, so many different kinds of practices. So this slide was thrown in just to expand a little bit.
Yeah.
I really like the teamwork here. We did this together, so those slides were not mine. Casey did them, or Tina.
This slide was Casey. The next slide was mine, and it's a nice segue, Casey, because it goes right into. I mean, what you just said makes me think exactly of Cybernetic Serendipity, which was the first major museum exhibition of what we now might call digital art. And if you go back and you look at Cybernetic Serendipity, as Casey just suggested, it wasn't just a show of visual art. Equally important was music and film were also part of that exhibition. And in fact, computer music, and there's a wonderful book, I'm just gonna blank out on the name, the compilation from UC Berkeley Press on early computing art, and some of the essays in there are about poetry and music and film and not just visual art, and why can't I think of it?
Sorry, I don't have
Wow, I'm blanking out. Okay, well, I'll figure it out later. Anyway, it's got the essay on Alison Knowles' House of Dust, and it opens with the essay by Grant Taylor. Anyway, I can picture it. It's Basel week, you guys. Go, be gentle. So we did want to just harp on this for a second, that digital art does have a history. This is something that over the past few years, while we've all been sort of excited to see a larger conversation unfold, not just inside the mainstream contemporary art world, but also outside of it about digital art, it is not new. It has been around for at least 6 decades or so, and it's important, I think, to acknowledge pioneers, not just for the sake of getting history right, although as an art historian by training, I very much believe in getting the history right, but also so that we don't keep trying to reinvent the wheel or asking ourselves the same questions that previous generations of people have already tried to articulate answers for.
I just wanted to add that Cybernetic Serendipity also had a strong focus on language and also choreography, writing, and then also electromechanical sculpture. So sculptures that were cybernetic in the sense that they reacted to the environment and responded. So I think interactivity is another big area of this too.
Yeah. I mean, digital paradigms I think about a lot. Iteration, interactivity, right? What are the paradigms of the digital, and how do those unfold across different mediums, right? And sort of different tools and over the decades. And so, but as Casey was just suggesting, I think one of the reasons history is really important to look at is that it can actually expand our horizons. Right now we have a sort of narrow horizon where we do focus on the visual, but what would it mean to sort of think about digital art as something that also was about all of these other things, about choreography? I mean, computer dance has now had a moment with all of the shows that are bringing back, that kind of work, but yeah.
And this also was one of the reasons to the second slide, which is a very recent second image, sorry, which is a very recent show I did this year at the Whitney Museum, but work that was created in the 60s and early 70s. And around that time, Harold Cohen's Aaron as the first artificial intelligence software. And to Tina's point, it was very important to me to connect the dots at a time of text-to-image models and the explosion of prompt-based AI really point back to early expert systems and how radically different that approach was by Harold Cohen, really creating a software that tried to encode how one makes art or painting in his style, composition, color, etc. So not the statistical extrapolation from data sets of trillions of images, but really trying to encapsulate art making in an encoded process. And as Cohen put it, if I can do that, I learn more about painting than I could by making paintings. Yeah.
Now we're going to come back to this idea what you just said, we'll have to come back to that because it goes right into another slide. But for a second, to backtrack, I think throughout the history of digital art, we have seen that there is this kind of ambiguity. I like to think of it as a productive ambiguity with what we're actually talking about. And Christiane already gestured at that in her attempt to define a definition of the digital. And I think that this has become, I don't know if I want to say a problem, again, a productive problem perhaps, over the past few years where, for example, with the rise of NFTs, it's become a little muddy whether we're talking about a tool, a technology, a medium, an artistic style, a kind of movement, or a community. And so, again, I don't think we need to necessarily fix things. I just think we need to be really clear that when we're having a conversation, what it is that we're actually talking about. So do you guys have anything more you want to say about this based on the images on the screen?
Yeah, I think that movement component or community component is very important and has been at various points. That was definitely true for net art, yeah, and particularly the different scenes, net.art in Europe, and then the US scene, although people all knew each other. This is a diagram that, a map that Jody created at some point, and basically showing all of the artists group, by their IP addresses. And one of the points here that is nicely made is also how connected we all were around the world. So really, artists knew each other. There were really strong communities. I think that has become fractured a little bit more by now, but also simply due to scale, because there are so many more people making that art. I would also say the same thing is true for the NFT space. I think there's a lot of community. The community also often evolves around platforms. That has also always happened. I think you could say there is a feral file community to some extent, and specific artists or curators you find on that. And art blocks would be another one. And of course, they're also intersecting. But I think this doesn't completely align with a movement like Cubism, but at the same time, there is that moment of movement and of community.
Listening to you, I was actually reminded I was thinking about Cubism, but maybe conceptualism is a better way to explain this. That these terms, their meaning also changes, or again, how we use them. So, like when we in art history refer to conceptualism or conceptual art, that can actually mean different things, right? So, right now in 2024, somebody could identify as a conceptual artist with a lowercase c. We could say that their medium is conceptualism. But conceptual art with like a capital C, capital A could also refer to a very particular movement from the 1960s, right? That was defined by a sort of community of artists, some of whom, were working in different geographic locations and had different approaches. So, these terms, right? I mean, digital is not the only thing, right, in art history that has this issue, but it's just helpful to be reminded that it's good to be clear about how you're using this term. I mean, modernism itself, right? Modernism, you can have a capital M or a lowercase m, and you can refer to like modernist artists as being one thing, but then modernism is another thing, et cetera, et cetera. So
I think this slide might also be a good time that I want to mention that digital art, which we're using as our frame today, is not a monolith at all. Like we have net art that was made by artists doing their own thing completely outside of institutions. And then on the right, we have a slide that I didn't put in there of my work from the Bitforms gallery, which is a gallery showing digital work. And then there's also institutional support. There's a lot of like government festival fair institutional support in Europe. And so globally, there's all different ways that digital art is being supported, and also, again, to emphasize the fact that artists just do their own thing a lot too.
Which is why we love them. This does feed into the next question, which is the one I was going to circle back to after your last answer, Christiane, about what is the relationship between the digital and sort of mainstream contemporary art, let's say, or let's say modern and contemporary art is what we put on the slide here with a lowercase m, lowercase c. This is something that I think all three of us on the stage have thought a lot about in our different capacities. The illustrations that you see up here are from two exhibitions that were curated respectively by Christiane and myself, with her exhibition Programmed being a real inspiration for my exhibition Electric Op, which small plug, if you'll forgive me, is still on view until January 27th. So if anybody wants to go see it, it's at the Buffalo AKG Art Museum in Buffalo, New York. Casey is one of the artists in the show. And in both of these exhibitions, there's been many exhibitions that have happened of digital art over the past 30 plus years. A lot of those have really been about defining digital art, or perhaps the larger field of art and technology, of which digital art is a kind of subset. Christiane and I, in these two exhibitions, took a slightly different approach, which was actually about putting digital art into direct dialogue with contemporaneous practices that are outside of it, right? And so do you want to say a little bit more about the program show?
Yeah, Programmed was really meant to build those connections between more historical art and digital art, because people often think, oh, that exists in a vacuum. It suddenly came about, and it's very much indebted to and building on other practices. So Programmed was basically divided into two sections, and one of them built connections between software-based art, instructions and choreographies, and conceptual art, bringing that together. If you would flip the view of the image you see up there, you would look at, once again, Solowit's structure in the center, and then Casey's software structures in the background, which we projected next to one of Lewitt's wall drawings. And yeah, your work has been so influential in building these connections and making them very clear. So that was one section of the show. And then another section focused a little bit more on algorithmic instructions for moving image sequences, and was structured around that. And the whole show was drawn from the Whitney Museum's collection, but you seldom see something like Alber's next to John F. Simon Jr.'s panel, color panel, which actually algorithmically encoded Alber's assignments for his students and cycled through them.
So in lieu of talking about the Electric Op exhibition, I'd actually just love to hand it over to Casey to talk about your work that's on view in Electric Op, because as an artist, you've very directly thought about your relationship to modern and contemporary art.
Yes. Well, I think when I around 25 years ago, when I started writing software, making software in the context of contemporary art at that time, I didn't have a lot of knowledge of these past shows. I mean, this is something that's become more and more prevalent. There's more people graduating with art history PhDs who are writing about these things and publishing about them. And so the questions were, I'm making this work, what are the precedents for it? And so I did this project for the Whitney Artport looking at Saul Lewitt's work. The idea was like, what can the kinds of instructions that Lewitt was making for wall drawings, how can that be useful in thinking about writing code and writing software to make visuals? And so I've also been for about a decade doing these work that I call homages, these meta, and then insert the name of the artist. So this one's Meta Soto, which is based on this artwork you see on the right from Jesus Rafael Soto, which is a kinetic sculpture. It's a kinetic sculpture of these small wires that are hanging from monofilament, and they move just really gently in the air moving through the room, and then there's a grid of painted lines on the background. And so it's a kinetic piece. It's a piece that's always changing, always shifting. And so one of the ideas around this is that how can we learn from the way artists were working with paint, with kinetic sculpture, and it's basically research. It's research into through making rather than through direct like academic scholarship. And so the piece that we see here is Meta Soto next to the original at the Electric Op show.
So this brings us right into our next question, which is about the relationship between the digital and the physical, which is another one of these questions that I think has become, has a kind of renewed urgency, relevance over the past few years. And I think we all have a lot of thoughts. I will just say that for myself, I want to make sure that we're holding space for the validity of file-based works, and that not everything needs to become something physical in order for it to have cultural value or perhaps even financial value. it is also possible to think about what it would mean to translate the digital file-based work into a physical object. I think that that is a question that artists can pose to themselves, among many other questions that artists can pose to themselves, and then work through to something really interesting. I just am a little bit worried, cognizant of the fact that we're speaking in the context of a fine art fair, that there has always been a market pressure, right, to make physical and discrete objects, and that's basically how we wound up with like video sculpture, which is another panel. But yeah, to sort of think through. And I also want to, just before we launch into the answers here, to think a little bit about what we even mean by physical versus digital. I like to remind people that there is no such thing as a truly immaterial artwork, and that even a file-based work, you are still experiencing it through your sensory apparatus in time and space, through the interface of a hardware system that also is a physical object. And so, yeah, so with sort of that as preamble,
yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack. We could spend the whole panel talking about these relationships. I wrote an article literally decades ago called "The Myth of Immateriality," with the "im" in parentheses, because of these software-hardware relationships. But I think around 2005 or in the early 2000s, and then until 2011 and onwards, we saw this real material turn among younger artists, of which you see two examples. In Raphael Rosendaal's case, he did an extension for the Chrome browser that looked at web design through the eyes of the machine and replaced all the images and everything on screen with these color blocks. And obviously this is recognizably Google. He would then go every day through the images that were taken by the extension, pick the nicest ones, and working with a textile museum in the Netherlands, creating these jacquard weavings out of them, also relating back to the history of computer art in the jacquard loom, and punch cards. And Artie Vierkan's image objects are also really iconic here, works that take sculptural form but are completely based on the circulation of Instagram images of his objects, and then he reconfigures the artwork based on it. One company actually used one of the image objects as a logo, and I remember everybody asking Artie, are you going to sue them? He was like, no, this is the point of the work. This circulationism is what I'm getting to. Coming back to the art fair idea, I just want to briefly say, for decades, artists have always asked me, should I do some print of it, something physical to make it on the market? So-called post-digital work had it much, much easier on the art market, and younger artists were suddenly getting a lot of attention, and it always worried me because their teachers literally were forgotten in the process because their work was more software-based. So it's a tension we're still struggling with a lot, I think.
All right, so now we're sort of coming towards the end of our panel, and we appreciate all of you, because I know a lot of you here are very much interested, literally invested in the blockchain space, the NFT space, but we thought it was really important to have those other kinds of questions on the table before we got here. But yeah, let's talk about it. So what is the relationship? How do we understand the relationship between digital art and NFTs? Because I know even in the framing of this panel, there was some debate about whether digital art is a subset of, digital art is a subset of NFTs or vice versa? So that's a question. So Casey, you want to start with this one?
Yeah, how specific should I be?
Well, we're at the end of this panel, and there are other people who need to speak today, so I don't know. Perhaps I don't know if you want to speak personally as an artist, how you understand that relationship, or do you want to go ahead into feral file and talk about that?
Yeah, I just need to pause for one moment. I think what's really exciting is a lot of different people trying to make different things work. I think experimentation has been really exciting the last few years. And so sometimes things are happening completely outside of the art world. Sometimes things are happening deep inside the art world. And then there's people, I think like Feral Files, really trying to make bridges, trying to connect. But really, I think it's all about making opportunities for artists and making opportunities for curators as well and putting the two together. I think what we should all be trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to make opportunities for artists to make new work, for that new work to be exhibited, to be written about, to be contextualized in the best way. And so for me, that's the highest priority. I think for things that are fundamentally digital, as you said, nothing's immaterial, but for things that are fundamentally digital, blockchains are an extraordinary way of keeping track of things, extraordinary way of having a ledger that is immutable and that we all trust and is completely public and accessible to everybody. And so I think that's been a huge change in the ability to think about collecting the work. I think the other huge shift is decoupling access from ownership. So I think one thing I think is essential about digital work is that it's available everywhere, anytime, to anybody. It's completely accessible. And that is different from having certain rights that the collector may hold. I think, could we go to the next slide so we could kind of look at this? I think, and then I think the next one. And then, yeah, so I think things that I think are fundamentally digital include like virtual sculpture, things like Aria Harvey's work. And I think going back to this talking about things that are material, she goes back and forth between making 3D prints and modifying them and rescanning them and moving back and forth between the data representation and the physical representation. But I think, and this is still like really nascent, like how do we experience these works in a really wonderful way? Maybe I'll pause there and see what Christiane has to offer.
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything you said, but also want to come at it from a slightly different perspective. And of course, I'm also coming from a museum perspective, looking at this practically. So once again, there are distinctions to be made between NFTs being used as a certification mechanism. Even in our medium line, we treat those differently, like digital animation with NFT, for example, because it's not work that is generative on-chain. That would be a different category, and one that we have also more exclusively collected at the Whitney Museum. I think the blockchain and NFTs are a great way of basically certifying and having a public ledger for, let's say, circulating JPEGs. But other than that, I think a lot of digital work could not easily be copied, and it has been collected with paper certificates of authenticity for a long, long time. Even with net art, only early net art you could really copy. Later on there was so much server-based stuff going on that it couldn't be easily copied. So I'm not diminishing the value of that public ledger system. It's definitely important, but at the same time, it's not like, oh, now digital art can be collected. Also, from a museum perspective, for me, what always comes up is really the scope of a work. Like, we get offered a lot that is basically one smaller manifestation of a generative work sold as an NFT. And for me, it would always be, why not get the software? Why not get your software at a higher price than the NFT? So once again, I think it's fantastic that those are existing side by side and that there are different audiences, but it plays out in different ways. Same goes for provenance. Fantastic for something that got done yesterday, but if we bring a digital artwork into the collection of the Whitney, and there may be some people in the audience who have suffered through the process of filling out endless questionnaires, of unpacking the hardware and software relationship. And anything you can think of in relation to presentation. We expanded that with NFTs. Are we allowed to bridge, or burn or whatever? And one final thing I want to point out is that for me, NFTs are also very much existing in this gamified public space, which is really nice. When we bring them into a museum collection, we immediately transfer from a hot wallet into a cold wallet. We're weirdly putting them in a vitrine. We're also not into the trading. So I'm always wondering how much we're losing of that space by bringing them into museum collections. There's something artificial about it for me.
I don't want to add much more to that, but I just want to explain what's on the screen. So Christiane and I have both been responsible for acquiring tokenized artworks, NFTs, et cetera, however you want to phrase it, for museum collections. And just to point out that on one level, these questions are really philosophical, and another level, they're just really bureaucratic, right? And so how do you even write the medium line? And so first principle is you have to understand what is the relationship of the token to the artwork itself, right? So as Christiane already pointed out, in some cases, the token is actually conceptually part of the work. Some people have used the term like wallet art to describe this. So Ian Cheng from the collection of the Whitney Museum, you'll see here that the medium line includes the fact that it is an NFT ERC 721A token, because from the Whitney's perspective, the token is materially part of the artwork. I'm going to contrast that with the medium line for Casey's work in the collection of the Buffalo AKG Art Museum. And I don't know, Casey, now I'm sort of anxious that maybe we need to revisit this medium line. But at the time at which the medium line was written, it was determined that the token that accompanied it was simply a mechanism for determining and recording provenance and authentication, and that the work itself was not a token, and that the fact that there was a token attached to it was not really what the art was in some really fundamental ontological sense, right? So the medium line here is JavaScript, HTML, and CSS files, that's what the work is in sort of a profound way. But this is all to say that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer, right? That it really depends on the nature of the practice. And that's, again, one of the reasons it's so exciting, but also so challenging to work with this kind of material from an art historical and an institutional perspective. I have no idea what time we started, but I think, okay, we got 5. Okay, great. So just to sort of, was there anything more you guys wanted to say about that relationship? I mean, one thing we didn't really clarify, maybe because we sort of assumed the knowledge in the audience, but maybe we should just say for a second that, for those who are really unfamiliar with NFTs, non-fungible tokens, they can be used to establish a kind of ownership over any kind of asset. It could even be a physical asset. And when we talk about NFTs, we could be talking about tokens that are used to establish ownership over things that are memes or other pieces of digital cultural heritage that have nothing to do with art, right? And so I always just try to be really clear about that. And it's why I'm very uncomfortable with any kind of language that really foregrounds the NFT as sort of defining an artistic style or movement, right? So, yeah.
I just wanted to say I think contracts are really interesting, and like they build on this tradition of artists, conceptual artists, relational aesthetics, artists who are working with participation, where artists have been writing contracts like pre-blockchain for a long time, and so I think that's another really promising and exciting medium that's emerging at the moment, like blockchain contracts.
Yeah, and we need much better ones. I'm grateful to all of the artists who have worked in that space and done that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the contract is, first of all, the contract can actually be a medium, right, of art making. The transactions can be a medium of art making. Anything can be a medium of art making. But also, it's very interesting to think about what is the what, right? Like, what actually is the work? What aspects of this are integral to the aesthetics of the piece, right? On a conceptual level as well as a visual one. And so that can be established and articulated in these kinds of contracts, right? And so we're going to hear later on in this event about conservation questions, and that's really where you have to really know what the what is. So just to wrap up, I think you hopefully can understand from the conversations we've been having here that there is a long history. There are many really profound and interesting questions when it comes to working with digital art. But I think all of us are very excited to see that there is, in this moment, and by this moment, I mean like this decade, but also very specifically like fall 2024, a very marked investment in digital art on behalf of major institutions in the art world. And so just calling out that this season there is this wonderful serendipity of sort of these coterminous shows that are happening with Electric Op and then also Radical Software, The Living End, and Electric Dreams, all being concurrent right now. For those of you who have been following digital art for a while, you know that this just happens once in a while. I've already cited multiple times, like just in the past few years, it's like 2016 was VR, 2017 was AR, 2021 was NFTs, 2022 was AI, and you'll see, like there's like a 6 month to 2 year lag where those exhibitions, about those things start to emerge. And so it is cyclical, and part of that is, digital art, but part of it is also just that's how the art world works, right? I mean, trends emerge, movements emerge, but we are right now in the midst of a sort of exciting moment where there is a lot of energy and attention. And I think the big question that I have, and sort of the responsibility that I would put out to all of you who are part of the art world, whatever your capacity may be, is there going to become a moment at which digital art is a sort of sustained and regular part of the conversation? And that there's a kind of baseline level, right? I mean, even painting, for example, goes in sort of cycles, right? Where like suddenly, like I walked around the main fair, yesterday, and I was like, wow, textiles, we're doing textiles this season. Got it, okay. Which has been a thing for a little while now, but it's definitely, reaching a kind of apex. So everything goes up and down, but there is always a baseline, right? Like there will always be painting, there will always be sculpture, there will always be something. Very little video right now. Video has almost entirely dropped out of the conversation, at least in this market context right now. But anyway, like what's when are we going to reach the point where there's sort of like a baseline of digital art being part of the conversation, and what can we all do? I'm going to include all of us in this to help bring that art world into being. So. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you.